Another one of our focus for this week is the fairy tale, and I would bet my last dollar that all of you all are familiar with the fairy tale, from the Grimm's brothers to Hans Christian Andersen to Disney. Fairy tales have become this kind of staple in our childhoods and our children's lives. So the fairy tale is one of the final tales of origin that leads to the development of the short story genre. So, what do we think of when we think of fairy tales or folk tales, so to speak? But fairy tales were first recorded in the 12th to 15th centuries. Think of someone like Marie de France in our previous video. But they were considered to be wonder tales, stories of magic, stories of fantasy, these kind of wonderful episodes where characters become with these wonderful characters, events, or symbols that really are not necessarily designed to be true. And we don't expect them to be true. However, there are things that we can take from these unbelievable stories with timeless settings, and these kind of unspecific generic places and one-dimensional characters. And the purpose, like the stories that we talked about last week, the purpose of these origin stories, one, is to teach a lesson, to kind of reflect and shape a culture in a way that helps reflect universal themes and metaphors in this very alien world that we can then transfer onto our own lives. They're meant to teach us how to navigate our own lives, because I think about it, as we grow up, we are going to face challenges that are very unfamiliar to us, much like the tales of the fairy tale. So what's kind of interesting is that fairy tales all have this same similar structure, and that structure helps us with this kind of facilitation of remembering or recalling. Think about, how do they all begin? Once upon a time, right? In a land far away. And this structure helps us store, remember, and reproduce plot and change it to fit various different experiences. These structures also provide us with easily identifiable characters that are associated with particular social classes, desires, professions, um, you name it. They're easily identifiable. And these characters are a way to introduce wonder and hope for change. And by wonder, I mean astonishment, fear, awe, reverence, excitement in a universe in which anything can happen. Also dependent on this structure, if we go back to talking about structure, we are always introduced with a protagonist who is confronted with something forbidden, some sort of challenge, a protagonist who has to depart or be banished. I mean, if you think back to when we were talking about the romance or the adventure, and that kind of integration, disintegration, reintegration, where a protagonist takes on or is given a task related to that thing that is prohibited. And usually that task is a sign or mark or stereotype of character. So, for example, curiosity, right? Is one of those things that we see in Blueberry. For example, her task is to stay away from something, and that curiosity is something that is prohibited, yet she cannot resist. So keep that in mind. Also, part of that structure is a significant encounter of some kind. The protagonist will meet with enemies or friends. We also have an antagonist in which there's associated some sort of evil entity. We have a witch, an ogre, a monster, and sometimes that antagonist will not always necessarily look evil, but there will be something off about them. There is some sort of miraculous change where our protagonist is tested, and at the end, there's always some sort of success. And success is usually found in the form of marriage, acquisition of money, survival, wisdom, or a combination of all four. And the key the key to any fairy tale and the focus of any fairy tale is that idea of transformation, change. And this transformation is a lot of times, sometimes literal. A person is transformed physically. That transformation can be of social classes. We go uh, up a social class, or we are transformed or reinstated into the one in which we were born. For example, with something like Cinderella, um, we have a transformation from youth to maturity, from ignorance to wisdom, from light to dark, all of those types. I mean, and I hope that you guys see a recurring pattern here, where we are focused on that transformation of the individual, that change in the individual, for better or for worse. So our characters, who often are the ones who are transformed, function usually according to a social class or profession. And the transform or the transformation is a way to cross boundaries. So we'll talk more about that as we move on, and when we have our class discussion. But keep that idea of in mind, this kind of crossing of boundaries and the transformation of the self. Usually we have a hero who is of humble origin, sometimes and sometimes not. Simple, naive, they're untainted, they believe in miracles or this reverence of nature. They want happiness. There's some sort of when when you guys think of the hero, I want you guys to think of the innocent, right? The young, which is not necessarily ironic when you look at who is the intended target for fairy tales: children, right? The innocent. And usually that innocent or the hero is met with a villain who uses words and power to exploit, control, transfix, incarcerate, and destroy intentionally for personal benefit. And I know that's a mouthful, but when we look at our villain, especially with someone like Bluebeard, I want you to look at how he uses his power to exploit our innocent. Usually, there is no respect or consideration for nature and other humans. And nature, I mean nature as in the natural world, but also the order of the natural world, of laws, of rules, of order. And in order to get their personal gain, they or to achieve their goal, the villain is going to abuse power or magic for their own selfish desires. So we are reading two fairy tales, and they are very different in their presentation. We are reading a German fairy tale, which is Cinderella by the Brothers Grimm, and we are looking at a French fairy tale with Bluebeard and Charles Perrault. Um, What's interesting is these stories of Cinderella and Bluebeard and a number of other fairy tales that each of these guys collected are they're not original to them. They are stories that have been handed down and passed down throughout the ages that they are responsible for compiling and kind of transforming and making something new, if you will, to them. I want to talk a little bit about Charles Perrault really quickly. He was writing during the 17th century, which is earlier than these guys. And he was a lawyer, he was a French lawyer, but is most notably remembered for his belief in the study of literature and how it evolves over time, and specifically in his storytelling and collection of children's tales called the stories of Mother Goose. So if you've ever heard of Mother Goose, you can thank this guy right here. His fairy stories in Mother Goose, so I think that included in that is Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots, Bluebeard, and a version of Cinderella. All of these stories were written to amuse children. That was his target kind of audience. And he retells them in a style that is simple and free from affectation. They're designed to be instructive. Versus the Brothers Grimm, the Grimm brothers, these German guys, they didn't set out to write stories for children. Keep in mind, these guys are writing probably 80 years after Charles Perrault. I don't know how to say his name. Perrault. We're going to call him Perrault. They're writing about 80 years after him. These guys are writing in the 18th century. And while the Brothers Grimm and their children's and household tales, later titled Grimm's Fairy Tales, are childhood defining stories, the Grimm brothers didn't curate this collection for children. They wrote it as an academic anthology for scholars of German culture, and not necessarily as a collection of bedtime stories for young readers. And what's interesting is that these two guys spent years traveling, looking all over in all of these historical books, seeking oral storytellers, to find all of these various folk tales to put together in one anthology. And what they found, mainly through their studies, is that most of these storytellers were women, and they would tell these folk tales and these various different materials to their children as a way of entertainment, as a way of kind of didacticism, whatever you want to call it. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that you'll notice that there is a very distinct difference between the way they tell their stories versus the way Charles Perrault tells and creates his. And there's a reason for that, because their goal for putting together these tales was part of a larger pursuit, and essentially they wanted to excavate and preserve the oral and written forms of German culture and kind of restore that treasure to the people. And that's what I think is so interesting about the Grimm brothers. But keep that in mind as we kind of parse through the differences between these two storytellers, these two story um, writers. So that's all I have for you in terms of fairy tales. Like I said, we're going to be looking at Bluebeard's Bride, or Bluebeard, which is interesting and fun, and it's used in it's one of my new favorite modern short stories is a retelling of the Bloody Chamber, is a retelling of the Bluebeard story, and of course we're going to be looking at Cinderella. So with having said that, I hope you guys enjoy the fairy tales that I have given you guys to read. Take a look at the discussion board options and the topics for discussion in our Zoom meeting for this week. I think those will help you as you read through the material. But let me know if you have any questions, and I can't wait to see what you guys make of our fairy tales and lays.